On July 13, 1959, millions of Americans turned on their television sets to watch a documentary that would define Malcolm X in the public imagination for decades. The Hate That Hate Produced aired on New York's WNTV, narrated by Mike Wallace. The program introduced mainstream white America to Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Within 2 hours, a narrative was established that would prove nearly impossible to overcome. The documentary's title itself was A Framing Device. It suggested that black anger and demand for justice were responses to white racism, but it focused viewers' attention on black reaction rather than white action. The program featured carefully edited footage of Nation of Islam meetings, Malcolm speeches, and interviews. Wallace's narration emphasized words like hate violence and separation. The message was clear. These people were dangerous. What viewers didn't see was editorial context. Malcolm's speeches often lasted an hour or more, covering economics, history, international relations, and systemic oppression. The documentary reduced this complexity to inflammatory sound bites. When Malcolm spoke about self-defense as a constitutional right, editors isolated the word defense from its legal and historical context. His intellectual arguments became threats in the editing room. Print media followed television's lead. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and hundreds of smaller newspapers adopted similar framing. Headlines consistently emphasized conflict and danger. A typical example from 1962 read, Malcolm X tells Negroes to arm. The actual speech discussed the Second Amendment and cited Supreme Court rulings about citizens' rights to self-protection. This nuance disappeared beneath sensational headlines. Life magazine published a photo essay in 1963 titled The Violent Preacher. Images showed Malcolm pointing his finger emphatically during speeches. His face captured mid-expression to appear angry or threatening. These same photographic techniques, selective framing, capturing speakers mid-gesture, were rarely used when photographing white political leaders. The visual language communicated danger before readers encountered a single word. Television interviews became battlegrounds. When Malcolm appeared on programs, hosts frequently interrupted him, challenged his premises, and framed questions to elicit controversial responses. A 1964 appearance on the Chicago-based program City Desk showed this pattern clearly. The host asked Malcolm if he advocated violence. Malcolm explained he advocated self-defense, a constitutional right. The host interrupted. But that means violence. Malcolm tried to distinguish legal self-defense from aggression. The host moved to another inflammatory question. This interview style contrasted sharply with the respectful dialogue extended to other public figures. When white politicians discussed military strength or Second Amendment rights, interviewers nodded thoughtfully. When Malcolm discussed the same concepts, he faced hostile interrogation. The double standard was systematic and deliberate. Media coverage also employed what scholars would later call strategic amplification. When Malcolm made statements about racial separation, these received extensive coverage. When he discussed economic exploitation, police brutality statistics, or housing discrimination, media attention evaporated. His critique of American power structures was threatening. Media coverage channeled this threat into racial antagonism, making it easier to dismiss. The constant media focus on Malcolm's religious affiliation with the Nation of Islam served another framing purpose. By emphasizing what seemed exotic or unfamiliar to white audiences, coverage made Malcolm appear foreign and un-American. His deep knowledge of American history, his citations of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, his engagement with American political philosophy, these elements contradicted the desired narrative and were minimized. Newspapers frequently described Malcolm, using terms rarely applied to white leaders. He was fiery, militant, angry, and controversial. White politicians who made far more extreme statements were passionate, principled, or outspoken. This linguistic framing subtly communicated that Malcolm's anger was irrational rather than a reasonable response to documented injustice. The media's treatment of Malcolm existed within a broader pattern of civil rights coverage. Journalists and editors made choices about which leaders to elevate, which philosophies to legitimize, and which approaches to condemn. These weren't neutral journalistic decisions. They reflected the political and social preferences of predominantly white newsrooms, serving predominantly white audiences. By the early 1960s, the media frame was set. Malcolm X was a violent extremist, the dangerous alternative to Martin Luther King Jr.'s respectable nonviolence. This binary obscured reality. It ignored the diversity of civil rights strategies, the evolution of leaders' thinking, and the legitimate debates within black communities about the best path toward liberation. Media had created a cartoon villain where a complex human being actually stood. On April 3rd, 1964, Malcolm X delivered a speech in Cleveland, Ohio, titled The Ballot or the Bullet. This address would become one of his most famous. Yet what most Americans heard about it came through media filters that stripped away its substantive political analysis. The actual speech was a sophisticated examination of American electoral politics, economic exploitation, and strategic approaches to civil rights. Media coverage reduced it to threats of violence. The speech opened with a call for political unity among African Americans regardless of religious differences. Malcolm stated, "Whether we are Christians or Muslims or nationalists or agnostics or atheists, we must first learn to forget our differences." This appeal for coalition building across ideological lines contradicted media narratives portraying him as a divisive separatist. News coverage rarely mentioned these unifying statements. Malcolm spent significant portions of the speech analyzing the American political system. He explained how both Democratic and Republican parties had failed black Americans. He detailed specific legislative betrayals, citing the Civil Rights Bill's weakening through congressional amendments. He discussed the filibuster, Senate procedures, and the mechanics of political power. This was policy analysis, not racial antagonism. Newspapers ignored these sections. The phrase "the ballot or the bullet" itself was presented by media as a violent threat. In context, Malcolm was explaining a choice. Either America would grant black citizens full political participation through voting rights, or people would pursue liberation through other means, which he described as their constitutional right. He was outlining a strategic framework, not issuing threats. The distinction mattered, but media coverage erased it. Malcolm's economic analysis in his speeches was consistently overlooked. In a 1962 address in Los Angeles, he discussed how black communities generated wealth that was extracted by businesses owned by people who lived elsewhere. He called for economic self-sufficiency, black-owned businesses, and community control of local economies. This was economic nationalism, similar to arguments made by labor unions and ethnic communities throughout American history. Media framed it as racial hostility. His international perspective also disappeared from coverage. Malcolm frequently connected the African American struggle to decolonization movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In a 1964 speech at the Audubon Ballroom, he explained how American foreign policy affected domestic civil rights. He discussed the United Nations, international law, and human rights frameworks. These speeches demonstrated global political literacy. Media portrayed him as focused solely on American racial conflict. When Malcolm discussed self-defense, his actual words were carefully calibrated to legal and constitutional principles. In a 1963 interview, he stated, "If the government doesn't want us to buy rifles, then the government should do its job and protect us." He was pointing to a failure of state protection and citizens' constitutional response. He frequently cited Supreme Court rulings and Second Amendment jurisprudence. Media translated this into advocacy for violence. Malcolm's speeches contain extensive historical references. He discussed slavery's economic foundations, Reconstruction's betrayal, the deliberate destruction of black economic progress in Tulsa and Rosewood, and the systematic denial of GI Bill benefits to black veterans. These weren't random grievances. They were historically documented facts demonstrating systemic patterns. Media coverage presented them as angry complaints rather than evidence-based arguments. His critique of white liberalism was particularly sophisticated, but especially misrepresented. Malcolm argued that white liberals often supported civil rights rhetorically while opposing structural changes that would redistribute power and resources. He distinguished between symbolic support and material solidarity. This analysis would later be validated by scholars studying the limits of mid-century liberalism. At the time, media portrayed it as rejection of white allies entirely. In Detroit, December 1963, Malcolm delivered Message to the Grassroots, a speech analyzing different revolutionary movements and their strategies. He compared the American Revolution to the French Revolution, discussed Mao's peasant organizing in China, and examined anti-colonial struggles in Kenya and Algeria. The speech was a comparative political science lecture. Media coverage, when it existed, focused on one line about revolution being bloody while ignoring the scholarly context. Malcolm's humor and rhetorical skill also vanished in media translation. He was a gifted speaker who used irony, wit, and dramatic timing. He engaged audiences with laughter before delivering serious analysis. He employed Socratic questioning, forcing listeners to examine their assumptions. These elements made him effective, but were absent from news coverage that presented only stern pronouncements stripped of their rhetorical context. Perhaps most significantly, media ignored Malcolm's repeated emphasis on human dignity. Across hundreds of speeches, he consistently returned to the theme that Black Americans deserved respect, self-determination, and recognition of their full humanity. This wasn't hate speech. It was a dignity movement. But dignity claims by oppressed people often sound like threats to those invested in existing hierarchies. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm X publicly announced his departure from a nation of Islam. This was seismic news in civil rights circles, yet mainstream media coverage remained superficial. Headlines focus on organizational conflict and personality disputes. What went largely unreported was that Malcolm was entering the most intellectually dynamic and politically significant phase of his life, a transformation that would fundamentally challenge the media narrative built over the previous 5 years. The break from a nation of Islam was not impulsive. Malcolm had been questioning certain teachings for months, particularly claims that all white people were inherently evil. His extensive reading of world history, philosophy, and political movements had created intellectual tensions with the organization's more rigid doctrines. He was also disturbed by credible allegations of ethical misconduct within the nation's leadership. These were serious theological and moral considerations. Media reduced them to power struggles. 2 weeks after leaving the nation, Malcolm founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated. This organization maintained Islamic religious practice, but separated religion from political activism. He explained in a press conference that Muslims and non-Muslims needed to work together on civil rights. This was a significant shift toward coalition building. Most newspapers gave it minimal coverage, continuing to frame Malcolm primarily through his Nation of Islam past rather than his evolving present. In April 1964, Malcolm embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj required of able Muslims. This journey would profoundly alter his worldview. In Saudi Arabia, he witnessed Muslims of every race and nationality praying together as equals. He wrote letters describing his experience, noting he had seen blonde-haired, blue-eyed individuals who were considered his brothers in faith. This challenged his previous position on racial separation. Malcolm's letters from Mecca were published in some outlets, but media treatment was often dismissive. Rather than engaging with the substance of his transformation, coverage suggested he was confused or politically weakening. The possibility that he was deepening his understanding, refining his analysis while maintaining his core commitment to Black liberation, was not seriously considered by mainstream commentators. After Mecca, Malcolm traveled throughout Africa and the Middle East for several months. He met with heads of state in Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, and other newly independent nations. He discussed bringing America's treatment of Black citizens before the United Nations as a human rights violation, not merely a domestic civil rights issue. This was sophisticated international political strategy. American media largely ignored it, focusing instead on whether he still hated white people. Upon returning to the United States in May 1964, Malcolm gave numerous interviews explaining his evolved perspective. He stated clearly that he no longer believed all white people were enemies. He said the enemy was a system of exploitation and oppression, which could have participants of any race. He emphasized that white people who genuinely opposed racism and were willing to take risks in that struggle could be allies. These statements directly contradicted years of media framing. In June 1964, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modeled on Africa's Organization of African Unity. The OAU was explicitly non-religious and welcomed people of all backgrounds who supported Black self-determination. The founding charter, largely written by Malcolm, outlined programs for education, economics, politics, and culture. It was a comprehensive community development blueprint. Media coverage focused almost exclusively on the organization's name and Malcolm's continued criticism of white power structures. Malcolm's speeches in this final period showed remarkable growth. At the Audubon Ballroom in December 1964, he discussed the need for sophisticated political education in black communities. He argued that people needed to understand the mechanics of power, not just react emotionally to oppression. He was advocating for political literacy and strategic thinking. This nuanced approach rarely appeared in news coverage. He also became more explicit about class analysis. In several late 1964 speeches, Malcolm discussed how poor whites and poor blacks were manipulated against each other by wealthy elites who benefited from racial division. He was identifying shared economic interests across racial lines, while acknowledging that racism gave even poor white people certain advantages. This complex class and race analysis was far too sophisticated for the media's preferred narrative. Malcolm's final months included outreach to civil rights organizations he had previously criticized. He met with Martin Luther King Jr. briefly in Washington, D.C. in March 1964. Photographs capture them shaking hands and smiling. Malcolm spoke respectfully about Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists. He praised their courage, even while disagreeing with strict nonviolence. He was building bridges, but media continued portraying him as divisive. In February 1965, Malcolm's home was firebombed while his wife and children slept inside. He publicly stated he believed the attack came from a Nation of Islam members angry about his departure. He expressed fear for his family's safety. 1 week later, on February 21st, he was assassinated. Media coverage of his death often recycled the old violent extremist framing, with some outlets suggesting he had brought violence upon himself. The evolution of his final year was largely erased from public memory. To understand the gap between Malcolm X's actual statements and media representation, direct comparison is necessary. Examining specific speeches alongside contemporary news coverage reveals systematic distortion. The pattern was consistent. Extract inflammatory fragments, remove context, ignore complexity, and reinforce predetermined narratives. This chapter presents verified examples of what Malcolm said versus what media reported he said. In November 1963, Malcolm gave a speech after President Kennedy's assassination. He used the phrase "chickens coming home to roost," suggesting that America's climate of violence had claimed the president. The Nation of Islam leadership immediately suspended him for this comment. Media coverage focused exclusively on this phrase, presenting it as celebration of Kennedy's death. What went unreported was the speech's broader analysis of American political violence, or that Malcolm later clarified he meant the country's violent culture, not that Kennedy deserved assassination. The "by any means necessary" phrase became synonymous with Malcolm X in media coverage, often presented as advocacy for indiscriminate violence. Malcolm used this phrase in a June 1964 speech after returning from Africa. In context, he was discussing self-determination and the right of oppressed people to defend themselves through whatever methods proved necessary for liberation. He explicitly referenced the American Revolution, where colonists used any means necessary against British rule. Media stripped away historical parallels and constitutional references, leaving only an impression of violent intent. In a 1964 interview with Les Crane, Malcolm discussed integration. Media headline: Malcolm X opposes integration. What Malcolm actually said was more nuanced. He stated he wasn't opposed to black and white people living together if it happened voluntarily and equally. He opposed forced integration into inferior facilities while excellent white facilities remained separate. He opposed integration as a substitute for justice and resource equity. His critique was of integration as a symbolic victory that left economic oppression intact. This complexity disappeared in coverage. When Malcolm discussed white people, media consistently emphasized any negative characterization while ignoring qualifications and evolution. In a May 1964 press conference after Mecca, he explicitly stated, "I believe that there are some white people who are sincere and in their own way are working toward a better understanding between black and white." This quote rarely appeared in newspapers. Instead, Articles recycled older statements from his Nation of Islam period, creating a false impression he had never modified his views. The media treatment of Malcolm's position on voting reveals deliberate misrepresentation. Malcolm strongly advocated for voting and political participation in the ballot or the bullet. He spent considerable time explaining why Black Americans should register to vote and use electoral power strategically. He criticized both major parties, but encouraged political engagement. Media headlines often suggested Malcolm opposed the political process entirely, ignoring his detailed discussions of political strategy and voter mobilization. Malcolm's statements about self-defense were systematically distorted. In numerous interviews, he carefully distinguished between defense and aggression. In a January 1965 interview, he said, "I don't advocate violence, but if a man steps on my toes, I'll step on his." This was conditional response to attack, not initiation of violence. He frequently cited legal precedent and constitutional protections. Media presented these statements as bloodthirsty threats rather than assertions of legal rights. A December 1964 speech at Oxford University demonstrated Malcolm's intellectual range and reasoned argumentation. He participated in a formal debate on extremism, arguing that extremism in defense of liberty was justified, citing historical examples from American history to anti-colonial struggles. The speech was well received by the academic audience. American media barely covered it, and when mentioned, focused only on the word extremism without the philosophical context of the debate format. Malcolm's comments about nonviolence were also misrepresented. He never said nonviolence was wrong for those who chose it. He said it shouldn't be the only option, and that demanding nonviolence exclusively from oppressed people while tolerating violence from oppressors was hypocritical. In a 1964 interview, he stated, "I think that anybody who takes a nonviolent position is not a victim of the violence being inflicted upon him. That's fine. But I don't think anyone has the right to tell the Negro to be nonviolent unless they have the power to make the white man be nonviolent." This was critique of double standards, not rejection of nonviolence itself. The systematic nature of media distortion becomes clear when examining coverage patterns across multiple outlets. The New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, and smaller regional papers employed remarkably similar framing techniques. They selected identical quotes from hours-long speeches, used similar inflammatory adjectives, and structured stories to emphasize conflict. This consistency suggests shared assumptions and editorial priorities rather than independent journalism. What Malcolm actually said was available to anyone who attended his speeches or read full transcripts. Thousands of people heard him in person and recognized the gap between their experience and media accounts. But media had the power to shape perception for millions who never heard Malcolm directly. The mediated version became reality for most Americans, then and for decades after. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965. 3 men were convicted of his murder, though questions about the full truth persisted for decades. In 2021, 2 of the convictions were vacated after new evidence revealed prosecutorial misconduct and FBI withholding of exculpatory information. This late justice for wrongful conviction mirrors the broader historical injustice of Malcolm's misrepresentation. Both involved institutional power shaping narratives contrary to truth. In the immediate aftermath of Malcolm's death, media obituaries largely recycled the established violent extremist frame. The New York Times obituary acknowledged his intelligence, but emphasized controversy and conflict. Time magazine's coverage focused on his gospel of hate. These characterizations, written within days of his assassination, would influence how millions understood his life and work. The evolution of his final year, his intellectual growth, and his movement toward broader coalitions were minimized or omitted. Within Black communities, however, a different memory persisted. People who had heard Malcolm speak directly, who had read his actual words, who had witnessed his transformation, maintained a more complex understanding. This created a dual historical memory. The media constructed Malcolm known to mainstream white America, and the actual Malcolm remembered by those who experienced him without media filters. This divide had consequences for how subsequent generations understood civil rights history. By the 1970s, scholars began serious academic study of Malcolm X, Historians examined his speeches, interviewed associates, and analyzed his political philosophy. Works by scholars like Manning Marble and later Michael Eric Dyson presented detailed, nuanced portraits that contradicted simplistic media narratives. Academic understanding evolved, but popular perception changed more slowly. The power of initial framing proved difficult to overcome. The autobiography of Malcolm X, published in 1965, became a crucial counter-narrative. Co-written with journalist Alex Haley, the book presented Malcolm's life and thinking in his own words. It became required reading in many educational settings and introduced millions to Malcolm's complexity. However, even this text had limitations. It was completed before Malcolm's final evolution, and Haley's editorial choices shaped the narrative in specific ways. Still, it provided access to Malcolm's voice that media coverage had denied. Hollywood's 1992 film Malcolm X, directed by Spike Lee, brought renewed attention to his life. The film attempted to present his evolution and complexity, though cinematic constraints required simplification. It sparked important conversations about Malcolm's legacy and introduced younger generations to his story. The film's impact demonstrated ongoing hunger for more complete understanding beyond media stereotypes. The lessons from Malcolm X's media treatment remain relevant. Modern media still employs similar framing techniques when covering social justice movements. Activist messages are reduced to sound bites, context is removed, and complexity is sacrificed for controversy. The phrase outside agitators, used to discredit civil rights workers in the 1960s, reappears with each new movement. Understanding how Malcolm was misrepresented provides tools for recognizing contemporary media manipulation. Educational curricula have gradually incorporated more accurate Malcolm X content. Many schools now teach his speeches alongside Martin Luther King Jr.'s, presenting both as important but different approaches to civil rights. Students learn about Malcolm's evolution, his international perspective, and his sophisticated political analysis. This represents progress, though implementation remains uneven across different regions and school systems. The declassification of FBI documents through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal the extent of government surveillance and disruption campaigns against Malcolm and other civil rights leaders. COINTELPRO documents show coordinated efforts to prevent coalition building between different civil rights organizations. These revelations confirm suspicions about institutional efforts to discredit Malcolm and demonstrated how government agencies work with media to shape public perception. Malcolm's emphasis on self-determination, economic independence, and psychological liberation from internalized oppression influenced subsequent movements. Black power activists, Pan-African organizers, and contemporary racial justice movements drew inspiration from his thinking. His insistence on black people defining their own struggle rather than accepting white moderate timelines and methods resonated across generations. This influence demonstrates the power of his actual ideas, not the media caricature. International perspectives on Malcolm often differ from American media narratives. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Malcolm was respected as an anti-imperialist thinker who connected local struggles to global systems of oppression. His international reputation was substantially more positive than his domestic media portrayal, revealing how different audiences with different information sources reached different conclusions about the same person. The contrast between media portrayal and historical reality raises fundamental questions about narrative power. Who controls historical memory? How do distortions in real-time coverage affect long-term understanding? What responsibility do media institutions have when their past coverage is revealed as systematically biased? These questions extend beyond Malcolm X to broader issues of how history is written and remembered. Accurate history matters because it affects present understanding and future action. When Malcolm X is remembered only as a violent extremist, his sophisticated political analysis becomes inaccessible. His evolution toward broader coalition building is forgotten. His intellectual contributions to understanding systemic oppression are lost. Recovering accurate history recovers useful knowledge. Malcolm X's actual legacy is complex. He was imperfect, changed his mind, made mistakes, and grew intellectually. He challenged comfortable assumptions and demanded more than symbolic progress. He insisted on dignity and self-determination. He connected American racism to global systems of exploitation. These contributions deserve understanding on their own terms, not through the distorted lens of media that feared what he represented. The gap between who Malcolm was and how he was portrayed reveals not just one man's story, but how power shapes truth itself. If this documentary revealed something about Malcolm X you didn't know before, if it made you question how history is told and who gets to tell it, then this message matters beyond just one person's story. The truth doesn't spread itself. You spread it. Hit that subscribe button right now if you want more historically accurate content that cuts through the narratives we've been fed and gets to what actually happened. We're building a community of people who care about real history, not convenient myths. Comment below. What surprised you most about the gap between Malcolm's actual words and how media portrayed him? Have you seen similar patterns in how modern movements are covered? Your insights add to this conversation and help others learn. Share this video. Seriously, share it with someone who only knows a media version of Malcolm X. Share it with history teachers. Share it with anyone who's ever said, "I never learned this in school." Every share helps counter decades of misrepresentation. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we drop the next documentary exposing hidden truths about overlooked American heroes. This isn't just about the past. Understanding how media shaped Malcolm X's image teaches us how to recognize manipulation happening right now. We have the power to reclaim accurate history. Let's use it. Subscribe, comment, share, now.